Sewing commences on my 1920s outfit mock-up this week, but not without a thorough ironing session first. This is a flat sheet that I bought cheap from my local Goodwill store, and there's no exercise quite as futile as trying to iron it out entirely. A twin flat sheet has about 2 2/3 yards of fabric in it. In the end, I ironed just enough for the pieces that I needed to cut. I've decided to start by making the tunic, one of 3 garments included in this pattern from the Vintage Pattern Lending Library, the link to which will be in the video description. Why the tunic first? Because it has the fewest instructions, naturally. The tunic back piece is pinned against the fold of the fabric. This goes smoothly for me, but once I start pinning the other sides, I realize pinning on a cushioned ironing board is a pain, as the pins tend to pick up the ironing board cover along with the fabric. I figure out a better approach eventually, but not in this video. I trim off the excess fabric, and then it's over to my workstation to cut along the pattern edge. These are Ginger 8-inch knife edge dressmaker's shears that I bought online, and they're an absolute joy to use. I've only injured myself once since acquiring them, which is sadly impressive. Time for some Tailors Tacks. The instructions recommended using Tailors Tacks to mark the notches. This was my first time using Tailors Tacks, so I cut the notches outward like I'm used to doing, just in case I couldn't figure them out. The process turned out to be very straightforward, however, and I ended up foregoing the notch cutting on the rest of the pattern, and only used the Tailor Tack method. The sleeves had a lot of notches to mark, so I broke out some thread so sparkly that the camera can't even focus on it. It's the kind of thread that looks fun until you start working with it. Getting it through the needle eye took 5 minutes because it kept fraying. I would like to point out that these tacks are way too short. If you learn anything from this video, please let it be this. Make your Tailors Tacks as long as possible. Now we hit our first pattern curveball. The tunic front piece is to be aligned on the fold at the center front. However, the seam allowance for the neckline extends past the fold. There were no seam allowances on the original pattern that this pattern is copied from, and that's part of what's great about the Vintage Pattern Lending Library. They add the seam allowances so you don't have to factor them in while cutting. My guess is that this is a pattern oddity that they had to work around. So I went ahead and cut according to the edge of the pattern piece and marked where the allowance ends on the fabric in case I need it later. Next up, removing the pins. Featuring this dorky cube pincushion that I made a long time ago before I knew anything about invisible hand stitching. Rumor has it, I still don't know anything about that. I find the process of removing pins to be far more enjoyable than the process of pinning. Separating the pattern from the fabric without pulling out the Tailors Tacks is a bit more stressful and fiddly. Miraculously, I had no mishaps at this point. But again, I should have made them long enough to be tied into loops, or perhaps used much thicker thread as they did eventually fall out. Following the pattern instructions, I began by joining the front and the back of the tunic at both shoulder seams. I opted to sew regular seams on this entire garment so that I could unpick them easily if necessary. Spoilers, it becomes necessary. When I begin on the real version of this outfit, I'll likely opt for French seams for a nice finish and added durability. But for now, regular seams with a 3/4 inch allowance it is. Perhaps you've noticed how dark it's getting. This will be my excuse for the first mistake that I make on this project. But first, let's whip through some side seams. My sewing room is also the bedroom, so I make an effort to keep it as tidy as possible, which means that unless I'm ironing something large, I use this tiny board that folds up quickly and hides in the closet when not in use. The full-size ironing board only comes out when absolutely necessary. Seams flattened, it's time to try on the mock-up for the first time. It's about as baggy and unflattering as I expected it to be at this point, but the shoulders are in the right spot, which is very reassuring. And there it is, folks, my first mistake of this project. I completely missed the sentence where it states very clearly to ease the front pattern piece between the notches. Did I notice the gap between the edges of the front and back piece even though the tacks were all lined up? Yes. Did I think about why that might be? No. Thankfully, the unpicking is minimal, and I attain proper easing first thing the next morning. I also take the opportunity to add some safety pins to where I think the neckline ought to end at about my navel based on the pattern illustration, and at my desired waistline. This isn't my actual desired waistline for the record, but based on my limited understanding of the 1920s fashionable silhouette, I suspect that it should hit at the hip to ensure a straight, unbroken line from the bust down. Finally, I stare existentially into the full-length mirror directly behind the camera and think about how this silhouette is the complete antithesis to how I usually dress. Maybe on my next project, I'll turn back the clock a few more decades. Until then, join me next week when I discover that hand hemming can be quite relaxing, and a dropped waist might not actually work on this garment. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon.